Hello, and thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. Something that has always vexed me is when people who do not believe in God tell me what God is supposed to do. If you don't know this, a very common argument, I guess it is an argument, but certainly a protest by atheists and skeptics when it comes to God's existence, is it goes something like this. If God were to exist, or if God did exist, he would or she would or it would do this. It's the would. God would do this. It's very common when you listen to debates and discussions and so forth. I want to say just a couple or a few very quick things about that. I don't find that convincing. I don't. You need to ask the person who says this to you, tell me why it is that God would necessarily do what it is you think the God should or would do. Why is that? I often hear it on the same topics. For example, the creation of the universe, or the way the universe is designed. If God did exist, you would see the universe more efficient, or you wouldn't see it so large, or you wouldn't see it with so many planets, or you wouldn't see such destruction. Because, of course, the assumption is God would have designed the universe differently than what he did. Now, to those particular thing I'd say is, we know based on the laws of nature as we understand them, it necessitates that the universe be the size it is, and the constants and quantities be what they are so that it produces life. In other words, there are reasons why it is the way it is. But let's forget that for a second. I'm still baffled by the demand that God would have designed the universe a certain way if God exists. Well, I do think God exists. I'm convinced of it. But it's a legitimate question to the person who raises the question. Why do you say that? Really? Why is it the case that God would have done it the way you think I'll say he just for shorthand because I'm a Christian. Why is it? And so ask the person that question. Why is it? And if the person just says, well, I just think. Well, this is a good thing, because sometimes I've asked that question to people in print and verbally. When they say, well, I just think he would have done that. That's fine, but just hear that very carefully, dear friend, that when a person says, I just think or I believe, that's fine, but you're asking for the reasons why they believe it. So you say, okay, that's what you believe, that's what you think. Can you tell me why it is you believe that? Why is it do you think that? What gives you the reason, the confidence, the conclusion that if God existed, he would have designed the universe the way you think he ought to have? And then you wait for an answer. And if it's just, well, I just believe that, I just think that's the way it should be, well, that's fine, but then you're just giving a psychological state. You're just saying, I believe it, like I believe chocolate's the best. I believe my favorite sports team is going to win. Well, okay. Well, that's fine, but that's not an argument. You're just telling me what you believe about something. You're not telling me why it is you believe that. And if you don't tell me why it is, and there's no evidence for that belief at all, well, then I don't find that convincing. Now, I might believe it too because I want to, because I like you a whole lot, atheist, and I change my mind. But that's not compelling to me. Another very common area to hear this is when it comes to suffering and pain and evil. If God existed, God would do X, Y, Z. God would not allow pain and suffering. If God existed, God would disallow animal suffering. He would disallow rape and torture and so forth, if God existed. Again, the exact same thing holds true. There are reasons that suffering exists, both naturally and morally. Morally, it happens because people choose to do the evil thing. So there are answers to why it occurs. My question is a different response to them, which is, why is it? What is it about God's existence that would necessitate God doing something a certain way? And when a person says something about suffering and evil and God, what I have found to be the case is they have a hidden assumption. The assumption is that if the kind of God they think would exist, then that God would do X, Y, Z. But that's the question. The question is, why do you think your kind of God must exist? For example, most people in my experience think God really, if there is a God, that God would make sure that all of his creatures, I'll say his again, his creatures are happy. We are his pets. So as much as I take care of my dog and my two cats in my own home, God would do that to us. He would make sure that No harm would come to them. They would always be safe and never be lost and always have enough food and water forever. Well, that assumes something about, of course, God's character and also what God wants to do. Now, my analogy breaks down immediately, of course, is I do have pets, and I deliberately cause them pain. I have caused them pain when I take them to the doctor to get shots. It's for their good. Sometimes I've pushed them off the table if they're near food and so forth. I've pushed them. I might have hurt them a little bit when their paws hit the ground. In other words, back to my point, of course, is you would have to make the argument. You need to give me evidence that God must do what it is you are convinced he must do. Why is that? Why is that? Sam Harris, often, he's a well-known atheist, often writes and speaks and blogs and lectures and whatever on God not existing and how silly it is to believe in religion. And I often have the same argument against him, at least in my mind. I have not had a dialogue with him yet. That is, Sam, I hear you, brother, but why is it, in his particular view, if God existed and God had anything to do with the Bible, God would only write in scientific knowledge? So if God exists and if God inspires things, we should learn more about quasars and black holes and how large the universe is. But come on. I mean, this is silly. Sam, why is it if God were to exist, he has to do what you want? Why can't, are chefs going to say if God existed, he would give me cosmic cooking lessons? Or poets, if God existed, he'd write the best poetry that's ever existed or teach me how to write poetry? If I were a mechanic, God would teach me about fuel injectors or old school carburetors. I mean, it just seems silly and it's profoundly arbitrary. And I found that to be the case, that it's a way to keep God at distance. I can keep him at arm's length. I can always find a way not to believe in him or his existence as long as I keep saying, well, I mean, if God did exist, that he would do X, Y, Z, and why doesn't he do it? And you theist or you Christian have to give me an answer right now why he's not doing that. I just don't find that convincing at all. Having said that, I sympathize with people who don't like suffering and evil. I don't like it either. So it's not like I don't have an emotional response, but intellectually, it's silly. It's nonsense. If someone said, well, I'm talking to a person, I say, I'm married. And I go, really? And they go, oh, really? Well, tell me about her. Where is she? Well, she's not right here. Oh, really? But you believe in her? Well, yeah, I believe in her. Well, let me see her. Well, I can't right now. She's not in the room. Well, what's she like? Well, she's, brunette. And what? She's a brunette. Yeah, she has brown hair. No. Because if your wife did exist, she would have blonde hair. And I said, why is that? Well, she would. I said, my wife is from Florida. Oh, well, that's exactly. Of course she'd have blonde hair. Now, why is that? Well, the hidden assumption is every person who comes from Florida must have blonde hair. Notice there's a hidden assumption. There's a whole bunch of hidden assumptions. Well, my question is, why is that? Why is it my wife, skeptic, gets to decide what my wife is? This is nonsense. The traits of my wife, or including myself, anybody's, it's the way they are. Now, there are contingent realities like the color of my wife's hair and the color of my hair. I could dye it if I wanted or whatever, what's left over. Of course, there are contingent qualities, but my point is you don't get to have me or my wife in ways that I am not currently. I want David shorter. Well, I'm not. I want David to be Asian. Well, I'm not. Well, if you would exist, you'd be Asian. I mean, this becomes dumb. It's a dumb demand, but that's exactly what so many atheists and skeptics do to slam the argument and shut it down. Well, if your God did exist, then this would happen. I'm going back over and over. Why is that? First off, there's probably a good Christian response to whatever it is whatever they think is problematic. Secondly, why do you get to decide what God would or would not do? And what reasons do you have for that? What evidence do you have that God would do it your way? Why is that? And thirdly, I'd say is you don't get to have God the way he's not. The question is, does God exist, and what do we think God has revealed about himself? And then does that comport with reality? Does it comport with reality that humans seem to be really good, but also corrupted? They can do good and do evil. And that all people do the same thing. And that it seems like people have always been doing that. I mean, going on the story, the answer is, well, yeah, it is. Well, that's the Christian story. That's how humans behave. Well, does all the world look illusory? Is it all illusion? Well, no. Well, that's Hinduism's. Big chunks of Hindus are gone. I mean, on and on it goes. The point is, just look at reality. And especially, of course, when you get to the face of Jesus. Does Jesus and the historical record demonstrate the kind of truth that we think comports the best reality? You might disagree with that. That's fine. But at least we're dealing with reality. And we're not saying, well, if Jesus did exist, he would be a black woman. I mean, this... So, anyway, that's silly. And we don't, on any kind of authority, get to arbitrarily decide who and what God is. The question is there a God, and what kind of God is he? And one, I'm just trying to be as fair as I can, as usual, trying to be fair. If I said the Muslim God did not exist, or their conception, why? Because if Allah did exist, he would do blank, blank, blank. Well, no, we don't talk that way. We figure out, okay, you say Allah exists. Now let's see if that understanding, the characteristics, comport with reality, comport with what is revealed. And so anything else, you're just assuming from the beginning that something doesn't exist because he or she or it doesn't fit your mold. That strikes me as unfair, just like my analogy with my wife. But anyway, just some quick reflections on that. So maybe one quick reflection of encouragement, if you are a Christian. Are there any ways that you are convinced God must be, or things he must do for him really to exist and or for him to be good in your life? And I did a few talks and I think podcasts and blogs on this before, but I always struck with Matthew chapter 11 when the John the Baptizer is in jail and he sends his disciples to Jesus' disciples and say, is he the one to come or not? Jesus in essence says, yes, I am. He says, the blind can see, the deaf can hear, and so forth. And then he says, and blessed is the one who takes no offense at me. It sure seems to me the implication is John the Baptizer is really on the edge, or he is being offended because Jesus is not rescuing him. John the Baptizer thought that Jesus was coming to baptize everyone with fire. His timetable's off. And apparently he's offended by it. Well, that's because he had expectations for Jesus. So even in Jesus' own ministry, people had expectations all the time. Well, I do too. And I find myself the most angry and the most upset with God, the Father, Son, and Spirit, when he did not meet my expectations. That's true for atheists. It's true for Christians. The question is, what kind of God is he really? Because we only get God the way he is. And praise God for that, because he's good. See you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, and also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways reached out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.